The heavy barrel of the suppressed pistol pressed into Min-jun's temple, the cold steel a sharp contrast to the humid Seoul night. His breath came in ragged hitches, fogging the window of the black sedan. Across from him sat Kang-dae, the dragon of Gangnam, his face a mask of carved granite. Kang-dae didn't look at the boy. He watched the rain lash against the bulletproof glass, his thumb tracing the gold signet ring on his pinky. "Your mother scrubbed my floors for 6 months to pay off a debt that wasn't hers," Kang-dae whispered, the sound vibrating through the leather seats. "And you repaid her by stealing from my vault." Min-jun's fingers drifted toward the heavy envelope tucked into his waistband, the paper damp with his own sweat. Outside, 3 men in matching suits stood under black umbrellas, their hands resting inside their jackets, waiting for the nod that would end a bloodline. Min-jun's journey to the back of that sedan began with a shattered bowl of rice and the smell of expensive cologne in a tenement hallway. Most people saw a monster when they looked at Kang-dae, a man who owned the skyline and the shadows beneath it, but Min-jun saw a final hope. This is the account of a widow's son who gambled his soul for a mother's life, and the predator who realized that some debts are written in more than just money. If you believe Min-jun deserves a chance to survive the world his father left him in, hit the like button so this story reaches those who fight for the voiceless. 8 hours earlier, Min-jun stood in the industrial kitchen of the dragon's sprawling estate. He wore a stained white apron 3 sizes too big, his hands submerged in scalding water. His mother, Hana, knelt on the marble floor 10 feet away, her knuckles raw as she hand-scrubbed the grout. She didn't look up when the heavy oak doors swung open. Kang-dae walked in, the click of his Italian leather heels echoing like gunfire. He stopped beside Hana, his eyes tracking the tremble in her shoulders. He reached out with a polished shoe, nudging her bucket. "The water is cold," he noted, his voice devoid of warmth. Hana bowed until her forehead touched the wet tile. Min-jun's grip tightened on a porcelain plate until the edges bit into his palms. He didn't see a boss. He saw the man who had signed his father's death warrant over a gambling debt. The first complication arrived when a courier entered, holding a black leather briefcase. Kang-dae gestured toward the center island, and the case was clicked open, revealing stacks of uncirculated bills and a singular, jagged blue diamond. Min-jun's breath caught. That diamond represented more than wealth. It was the Blue Widow, the rumored collateral for the very debt that had buried his father. Kang-dae's phone buzzed and he stepped out, leaving the briefcase open on the stainless steel counter. Min-jun looked at his mother's bruised knuckles, then at the blue fire reflecting in the polished silver. He moved without thinking. He snatched the diamond and a single stack of bills, shoving them into the waistband of his trousers. As he turned back to the sink, the door clicked. Kang-dae was standing there, his eyes fixed on the slightly skewed position of the briefcase. Kang-dae didn't shout. He walked to the counter, closed the briefcase and looked Min-jun directly in the eye. "A man who steals out of hunger is a thief," Kang-dae said, his voice dropping to a low hum. "A man who steals out of spite is a corpse." He reached out, his hand wrapping around Min-jun's throat, lifting the boy until his toes barely grazed the floor. Hana screamed, throwing herself at Kang-dae's feet, her pleas filling the kitchen. Kang-dae ignored her. He leaned in close, the scent of sandalwood and tobacco overwhelming Min-jun's senses. "You have your father's eyes," Kang-dae whispered. "Empty and arrogant." He dropped the boy and signaled to the men in the hallway. "Take him to the car. Leave the mother." Now the sedan sped toward the Han River, the city lights a blur of neon through the rain. Kang-dae finally turned his gaze to Min-jun. "Why the diamond?" he asked. "You couldn't sell it. Every fence from here to Busan knows its face." Min-jun wiped the blood from his nose with his sleeve. "It wasn't to sell," he spat. "It was to bury. Just like you buried my father." Kang-dae's expression didn't shift, but his thumbs stopped tracing the ring. He reached out and snatched the envelope from Min-jun's waist. He didn't find the diamond inside. He found a collection of yellowed betting slips and a photo of a man in a soldier's uniform. The car lurched to a halt under the Mapo Bridge. The rain hammered against the roof, creating a claustrophobic drumbeat. Kang-dae stared at the photo of the soldier. His jaw tightened, a small muscle jumping in his cheek. He looked at the betting slips, each one signed not by Min-jun's father, but by Kang-dae's own second-in-command, a man named Sang-ho. The realization hung in the air, thick and heavy as the humidity. Min-jun's father hadn't died for his own debts. He had been the fall guy for a traitor inside the inner circle. Kang-dae looked at the boy, then at the dark, swirling water of the river. He opened the door and stepped out into the rain, gesturing for Min-jun to follow. Kang-dae stood at the edge of the pier, the wind whipping his long coat around his legs. He pulled the blue diamond from his pocket. The boy had hidden it in the kitchen's ice machine, but Kang-dae's men were thorough. He held it up to the dim streetlight. "Your father was the only man who didn't flinch when I held a gun to him," Kang-dae said, his voice almost lost to the wind. "He died protecting a lie he thought was mine." He turned to Min-jun, his eyes burning with a new, lethal clarity. "Sang-ho told me your father was the traitor. He told me the widow and the son were the price of loyalty." Kang-dae handed the diamond to Min-jun. "Keep it. Hide it. Because tonight, the dragon burns Gangnam to the ground." The car sped back toward the estate, but the atmosphere had shifted from an execution to a war council. Kang-dae's phone was a blur of commands. "Seal the perimeter. No one leaves. If Sang-ho breathes, stop him." Min-jun sat in the corner, clutching the diamond, the weight of the stone feeling like a mountain. They reached the gates of the estate just as the first orange flames licked the second-story windows. Sang-ho wasn't waiting for a trial. He had decided to finish what he started. The black sedan smashed through the iron gates, tires screaming on the wet gravel. Kang-dae stepped out before the car had fully stopped, drawing 2 pistols from his shoulder holsters. "Stay in the car," he commanded Min-jun. "If I don't come back, the diamond is your ticket to Tokyo." Kang-dae disappeared into the smoke-filled foyer. Min-jun watched from the window, his fingers tracing the leather of the seat. Gunfire erupted inside, sharp rhythmic pops that echoed through the rain. He saw shadows dancing against the firelight, the silhouettes of men falling. Then a figure emerged from the side entrance, dragging a woman by her hair. It was Sang-ho and the woman was Hana. Min-jun's heart hammered against his ribs. He didn't have a gun. He didn't have Kang-dae's strength. He looked at the blue diamond in his hand, then at the heavy glass bottle of expensive whiskey in the car's console. He stepped out of the car, the heat from the house searing his face. Sang-ho was shouting into a radio, his pistol pressed to Hana's temple. He didn't see the boy approaching through the thick smoke. Min-jun smashed the whiskey bottle against the car door, the jagged glass glinting in the firelight. He lunged. He didn't go for the gun. He went for the arm holding his mother. The glass sliced through Sang-ho's sleeve and the man roared, dropping the pistol. Hana scrambled away, her knees scraping the gravel. Sang-ho turned on Min-jun, his face a mask of fury, his hand reaching for a knife at his waist. "You should have died with your father," he hissed. A single shot rang out. Sang-ho's head snapped back, a small red hole appearing between his eyes. He fell like a sack of stones. Kang-dae stood in the doorway of the burning house, his suit jacket gone, his white shirt soaked in blood and soot. He lowered his weapon, his breath coming in heavy, ragged gulps. He looked at Hana, who was huddled on the ground, then at Min-jun, who stood over the body with a broken bottle. Kang-dae walked over, his heels clicking softly on the gravel. He didn't offer a hand. He simply looked at the house, the empire he had built turning to ash. "The debt is paid," he said. "If this act of sacrifice moved you as much as it did me, drop a like so the algorithm knows the story of loyalty matters." The morning sun rose over a different soul. The estate was a blackened skeleton, the smoke still curling into the pale blue sky. Kang-dae stood on the sidewalk across the street, wearing a borrowed coat, his eyes fixed on the rubble. Hana and Min-jun stood beside him, their few belongings packed into 2 small bags. Kang-dae reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys and a passport. He handed them to Hana. "There is a house in Jeju," he said. "It is quiet. The water is warm. No one will look for the widow of a soldier there." Hana took the keys, her fingers brushing Kang-dae's scarred hand. She didn't say thank you, the word was too small for the weight of the moment. She looked at her son, then at the man who had been her tormentor and her savior. Min-jun stepped forward, holding out the blue diamond. "Take it," he said. "You'll need it to start over." Kang-dae looked at the diamond, then at the boy who had grown 10 years in a single night. He pushed the boy's hand back. "I am a dragon," Kang-dae whispered. "I don't need stones to breathe fire. Use it to become a man your father would recognize." Kang-dae turned and walked away, his silhouette shrinking against the backdrop of the rising sun. He didn't look back. He had no empire, no soldiers and no crown, only the weight of a truth finally told. Hana gripped Min-jun's hand, the two of them standing on the threshold of a life they never thought they'd own. As they turned toward the bus station, Min-jun looked back at the ruins one last time. He saw a singular black umbrella standing upright in the gravel, a silent marker for a man who had lost everything to protect the only thing that mattered. If you believe the quietest heart can be the strongest, leave a like so I know to tell more stories like this. The ferry to Jeju was crowded with tourists and families, the air smelling of salt and cheap coffee. Min-jun sat at the railing, the blue diamond tucked deep in his pocket, its weight a constant reminder. He watched the coastline of the mainland disappear into the fog. Hana sat beside him, her knuckles finally starting to heal, her eyes fixed on the horizon. They were free, but the shadows of Gangnam weren't easily left behind. As Min-jun reached into his bag for a bottle of water, his fingers brushed against a small hard object he didn't recognize. He pulled it out. It was Kang-dae's gold signet ring. Tucked inside the band was a tiny microchip, the size of a grain of rice. Min-jun looked at the ring, then at the dark water below. He realized then that the war wasn't over. The dragon hadn't just given them a house, he had given them the keys to the entire underworld. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. It was a single line of text that made his blood turn to ice. The dragon sleeps, but the sun must wake. He looked at the ferry's wake, the white foam churning like a warning. Gemini said. The ferry's engine hummed beneath Min-jun's feet, a rhythmic vibration that felt like a countdown. He stared at the microchip, the silicon surface glinting like an insect's eye. Beside him, Hana's head rested against the window, her breath steady in sleep for the first time in years. She didn't see the gold ring. She didn't see the message on the screen. Min-jun's thumb hovered over the delete button, but his pulse hammered against the metal. If he deleted the message, they were just refugees. If he answered, he was a target. The ferry lurched as it hit a swell, and a man in a gray windbreaker stumbled into the seat across from them. He didn't apologize. He opened a newspaper, the headlines screaming about the Gangnam massacre. Beneath the fold was a grainy photo of Kang-dae, captioned with a single word, deceased. Min-jun's vision blurred. The dragon was gone, leaving a boy with a diamond and a chip that likely held the bank accounts of every crooked politician in Seoul. If you believe the truth is more dangerous than a bullet, hit the like button so Min-jun's journey doesn't end in the dark. The gray man didn't look at the paper. He looked at Min-jun. The ring is a heavy burden for someone who hasn't finished high school, the man said, his voice a low gravelly rasp. He didn't reach for a weapon, but his posture was a coiled spring. Min-jun gripped the ring until the gold bit into his palm. I don't know what you're talking about, he replied, his voice cracking. The man leaned in, the scent of industrial soap and cheap cigarettes filling the gap between them. Sangho's people are on this boat. They don't care about Jeju. They care about what's inside that gold. Min-jun looked at the exit, then at his sleeping mother. He couldn't run with her and he couldn't leave her. He stood up, sliding the ring onto his pinky finger. It was too big, hanging loosely. Show me, Min-jun commanded, his voice finding a steel he didn't know he possessed. The gray man stood, gesturing toward the stern of the ship where the tourists didn't linger. They moved through the narrow corridors, the walls sweating with condensation. As they reached the open air of the back deck, the gray man stopped. He didn't turn around. He pointed at a black SUV lashed down in the cargo hold below. Two men stood by the car, their eyes scanning the deck. They weren't tourists. They wore the sharp, narrow suits of Sangho's remnants. One held a tablet, the screen glowing with a GPS tracker. Min-jun's heart skipped. They weren't tracking the ring, they were tracking the chip. The gray man turned, his hand moving to a holster beneath his jacket. I was Kang-dae's shadow for 12 years, he said. He told me if the house burned, I was to find the boy. He handed Min-jun a small, black device. This is a jammer. You have 60 seconds to get your mother to the lifeboats before they realize the signal is dead. Min-jun didn't wait. He sprinted back toward the cabin, his lungs burning with the salt air. He shook Hana awake, her eyes fluttering with confusion. We have to go. Now. He didn't explain. He dragged her toward the emergency stairs just as the lights on the ferry flickered and died. The jammer was working, but it had triggered the ship's alarm. Panic erupted in the main cabin as shadows scrambled in the dark. Min-jun pushed Hana into a corner behind a stack of life vests. Stay here. Don't move until the lights come back. He turned back toward the stairs, the ring heavy on his hand. He saw a silhouette emerging from the darkness, a tall man with a jagged scar across his throat. It was the courier from the estate, the one who had brought the diamond. He didn't have a briefcase this time. He had a combat knife. The dragon is dead, boy, the courier hissed, his blade catching the moonlight. Give me the chip and I'll let the widow live. Min-jun didn't back away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the whiskey bottle he'd kept from the car. The jagged remained still sharp. The courier lunged. Min-jun dived to the left, the knife slicing through the shoulder of his jacket. He didn't feel the pain. He swung the broken bottle, the glass catching the courier's forearm. The man roared, the knife clattering to the deck. Min-jun didn't stop. He tackled the man, the two of them tumbling against the railing. Below them, the white foam of the wake roared like a hungry beast. The courier's hand closed around Min-jun's throat, his eyes bulging with rage. "You're nothing," he screamed. A sharp crack echoed through the deck. The courier's grip loosened. He slumped forward, a red bloom spreading across his chest. The gray man stood at the top of the stairs, his pistol smoking. He didn't say a word. He walked over, grabbed the courier's body and shoved it over the railing into the dark water. He looked at Min-jun, then at the ring. "The ferry docks in 10 minutes, the gray man said. "They'll be waiting at the pier. We aren't going to Jeju. If you think Min-jun has what it takes to lead the remnants of the Dragon's Empire, hit the like button so his path stays clear." They didn't wait for the gangplank. As the ferry slowed near the rocky outskirts of the Jeju harbor, the gray man lowered a motorized dinghy from the side. Min-jun helped Hana into the small boat, her hands shaking as she clutched her bag. They lowered into the dark water, the engine a soft purr as they sped away from the massive ferry. Behind them, police sirens began to wail at the pier, the blue and red lights reflecting off the waves. The gray man steered them toward a hidden cove where a nondescript fishing boat waited. Inside the cabin of the fishing boat, the gray man sat Min-jun down and pulled out a laptop. "The chip doesn't hold money," he revealed, his fingers flying across the keys. "It's a live map of the gilded net, every hidden tunnel, every safe house, and every undercover agent Kang-dae placed in the government." He looked at Min-jun, the blue light of the screen reflecting in his tired eyes. "Kang-dae didn't die in that fire, Min-jun. He walked into it so the world would stop looking. He gave you the ring because you're the only one Sang-ho wouldn't suspect of being his successor." Min-jun looked at the ring, then at his mother, who was drinking tea in the corner, her eyes fixed on the distant shore. He realized the weight of the gift. He wasn't a widow's son anymore. He was the anchor for a ghost. The laptop beeped, a new message appearing on the screen. It was a video file. Min-jun clicked it. The grainy footage showed Kang-dae sitting in a dark room, his face heavily bandaged, but his bourbon-colored eyes unmistakable. "The debt is never truly paid, Min-jun," the voice said. "It just changes hands. Welcome to the family." The fishing boat turned away from Jeju, heading back toward the mainland. Min-jun stood at the bow, the wind whipping his hair, the gold ring finally feeling like it fit. He looked at the blue diamond in his other hand, then tossed it into the deep, dark water. He didn't need the stone anymore. He had the fire. If you believe the dragon's son is the hero Seoul needs, leave a like so I know to tell the final chapter of this war. The fishing boat cut through the fog of the Yellow Sea, moving toward a destination that wasn't on any map. Min-jun stood on the deck, the cold salt air stinging the raw cut on his shoulder. He looked down at the gold signet ring. It no longer felt like a piece of jewelry, it felt like a shackle. Inside the cabin, the gray man, whose name was revealed to be Han, was cleaning his weapon with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. Hana sat across from him, her eyes hollow, staring at the microchip on the table. She knew. She had seen that look in her husband's eyes years ago, the look of a man who had stopped belonging to himself and started belonging to the shadows. "We aren't going to Jeju, are we?" Hana's voice was a brittle whisper. Han didn't look up from his pistol. "Jeju is a grave, Hana SSI. Sang-ho has eyes in every port. We are going to the only place where the dragon's fire still burns." He looked at Min-jun through the window. "We are going to the iron market. If you believe a mother's love is the only thing that can keep a boy from becoming a monster, hit the like button so Hana's voice isn't lost in the roar of the engines." The iron market was a subterranean labyrinth beneath the decommissioned shipyards of Incheon. It was a city of rust and neon, where the law was written in lead and paid in blood. As the fishing boat docked in a hidden slip, Min-jun felt the weight of 1,000 eyes. Men in grease-stained coveralls watched them pass, their hands resting on the hilts of jagged knives. Han led them to a reinforced steel door guarded by two giants with scarred faces. They didn't ask for ID. They looked at Min-jun's pinky finger. The gold ring glinted in the flickering industrial light. The doors groaned open. Inside was a high-tech command center that contrasted sharply with the decay outside. Wall-to-wall monitors displayed live feeds of Seoul's financial district, police radio frequencies, and the private security cameras of Sang-ho's new headquarters. A woman in a sharp white suit stood at the center, her hair a silver blade. "The boy is small," she remarked, her voice like grinding glass. "But the ring is real." She was Detective Choi, the high-ranking officer Kang-dae had owned for a decade. She wasn't an ally, She was an investment. Sang-ho has moved the gilded net into a cloud server, Choi explained, pointing to a pulsating red map on the screen. He's auctioning off the identities of every undercover agent at midnight. If that server goes live, the dragon's legacy doesn't just die, it turns into a bloodbath. Min-jun stepped forward, the microchip in his hand. The chip has the encryption key, he said, his voice steady. But it needs a biometric override. It needs the dragon's fingerprint. Han and Choi exchanged a grim look. Kang-dae was gone, his hands lost to the fire of the estate. The room went cold as the realization hit Min-jun. The ring wasn't just a symbol. The inner band was lined with a microscopic lattice of Kang-dae's DNA and a haptic sensor. To use the chip, Min-jun had to wear the ring, but the override process would link his biometric signature to the dragons permanently. He would be flagged by every intelligence agency in the world. He would never be able to cross a border, open a bank account, or live a normal life again. If you believe the sacrifice of a normal life is a price too high for a boy to pay, drop a like so the algorithm knows the cost of this war. Don't do it, Min-jun, Hana pleaded, grabbing his arm. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. We can run. We can go to the mountains. Let the dragon's world burn. Min-jun looked at his mother, then at the monitors showing the faces of the agents Sang-ho was about to execute. Men with families, men who had risked everything because they trusted a monster like Kang-dae. He looked at the gold ring. He remembered the smell of the fire at the estate and the way Kang-dae had looked at him before walking into the flames. My father died for a lie, Min-jun said, his voice echoing in the high-tech bunker. I won't let these people die for a truth I could have saved. He stepped toward the terminal. Han placed the chip into the drive. The screen turned a violent red, demanding the override. Min-jun slid the gold ring onto his finger and pressed it against the sensor. A sharp, stinging heat radiated from the band, the lattice needles syncing with his pulse. On the screen the red map turned a cool deep blue. The gilded net was no longer being auctioned. It was being deleted. The doors to the bunker exploded. Sang-ho's men hadn't waited for the auction. They had tracked the biometric sync the moment Min-jun touched the sensor. Smoke grenades filled the room with a choking white haze. Gunfire shredded the monitors. Han dived over the console, pulling Hana to the floor. Min-jun was thrown back by the blast, his ears ringing, the gold ring glowing white-hot on his finger. Through the smoke he saw a figure approaching, Sang-ho's lead assassin, a man known as the Ghost. He held a silenced submachine gun, his eyes fixed on Min-jun's hand. He didn't want the boy, he wanted the finger. Min-jun scrambled backward, his hands searching the floor for a weapon. His fingers closed around a heavy glass paperweight. As the Ghost leveled his gun, a shadow dropped from the ventilation ducts above. It was Kang-dae. He wasn't the polished boss in the Italian suit anymore. His face was a map of burned scars, his clothes were rags and his left arm was in a sling. But his eyes were a forest fire. He didn't use a gun. He slammed into the Ghost with the weight of a dying sun, a jagged piece of rebar in his hand. The struggle was silent and horrific. Kang-dae fought with a primal ferocity, ignoring the bullets that grazed his shoulders. He pinned the assassin to the wall and drove the metal through the man's chest. Kang-dae turned to Min-jun, blood dripping from his chin. He didn't smile. He didn't offer comfort. He grabbed Min-jun's hand and looked at the glowing ring. You finished it, Kang-dae whispered, his voice a scorched rasp. The net is gone. Outside, the sirens of Detective Choi's tactical teams began to wail, but they weren't coming to help. They were coming to clean up the mess. Kang-dae looked at the door, then at Han. Take them. The back exit leads to the incinerator. Use the service tunnels. What about you? Min-jun shouted over the sound of the approaching boots. Kang-dae stood in the center of the room, the fire from the explosion reflecting in his bourbon eyes. He picked up a fallen rifle and checked the magazine. A dragon only has one death, he said. I'm just making sure mine counts. He shoved them toward the tunnel entrance. Run, Min-jun. Don't look back. Be the man I couldn't be. Han dragged Min-jun and Hana into the darkness of the tunnels. As the heavy steel door slammed shut, Min-jun heard the final, thunderous roar of gunfire from the room behind them. He ran through the damp, dark earth, the gold ring on his finger finally going cold. They emerged 3 miles away on a deserted stretch of the Incheon coast. The sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon, turning the gray water into gold. Han handed Min-jun a small, waterproof bag. There's a boat waiting 2 miles south. It'll take you to the Philippines. New names. New lives. Min-jun looked at the ring, then at his mother, who was staring at the distant smoke rising from the shipyard. He pulled the ring off his finger. The lattice had left a permanent, circular scar on his skin, a mark that would never fade. He handed the ring to Han. "Tell the world the dragon died today," Min-jun said. "And tell them the sun never existed. If you believe the greatest power is the strength to walk away, hit the like button so this story of redemption reaches the world." Min-jun and Hana stepped into the small boat, the engine humming a new song, a song of silence and peace. As they moved toward the horizon, Min-jun reached into his pocket and found a small, crumpled note Kang-dae had slipped into his hand during the chaos. He smoothed it out. It wasn't a bank account or a password. It was an address for a school in Manila and a single sentence: "The debt is paid. Go to class." Min-jun looked back at the receding shoreline of Korea, the gold sun reflecting off the water where the blue diamond lay. He smiled, a genuine tired smile. The war was over. The dragon was a legend. And the widow's son was finally just a boy. The Philippines was not the paradise promised in brochures. It was a humid, sprawling labyrinth of concrete and palm trees where the air tasted of salt and exhaust. Min-jun sat in the back of a brightly colored jeepney, the metal rattling beneath him as they navigated the crowded streets of Manila. Beside him, Hana clutched a grocery bag, her eyes no longer scanning for shadows, but her posture still held the rigid tension of a woman who expected the world to break at any moment. Min-jun looked down at his hand. The circular scar from the ring was a pale, jagged reminder on his pinky, a permanent brand of the night the dragon died. He was enrolled in the school Kang-dae had mentioned, a quiet, prestigious academy on the outskirts of the city. To his classmates he was Ji-hoo, a transfer student from Busan whose father had died in a factory accident. He was a ghost living in a sun-drenched purgatory. If you believe that you can never truly outrun a past written in blood, hit the like button so Min-jun's secret stays buried. The peace lasted exactly 3 months. It shattered on a Tuesday afternoon when Min-jun returned to their small apartment to find the door unlocked. He didn't rush in. He felt the hair on his arms stand up, a primal instinct honed in the iron market. He slid a small, concealed blade, the one Han had given him, from the lining of his school bag. He stepped inside, his footsteps silent on the linoleum. The apartment smelled of jasmine tea and something metallic. Something wrong. Hana was sitting at the small wooden table, her hands folded. Across from her sat a man in a linen suit, his face obscured by the shadow of a broad-brimmed hat. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a photo of Min-jun's father. "The Philippines is a long way to travel for a funeral, Ji-hoo," the man said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone. Min-jun recognized the accent immediately. It was the gilded net dialect, the refined, cold speech of the high-level bureaucrats who had once served Sangho. The man was Councilman Park, the sole survivor of the political purge that followed the deletion of the dragon's files. He looked at Min-jun, his eyes sharp and hungry. "You think the ring was the prize?" Park laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "The ring was just the key. The real treasure was the boy who could survive the sink. The boy whose DNA is now the only living bridge to the Moretti Swiss accounts that Kang-dae hidden away decades ago." Min-jun felt a cold sweat break across his neck. He wasn't a successor, he was a walking bank account. "I don't have the ring," Min-jun spat, his grip tightening on the knife. Park stood up, smoothing his suit. "You are the ring, Min-jun. Every time you scan your thumb to enter your school, every time you use a biometric sensor, you pulse a signal that we can track. You didn't delete the legacy. You just became its heart. If you think the dragon's final gift was actually a curse in disguise, drop a like so the algorithm knows the weight of this betrayal." Park gestured toward the window. 2 black vans were parked on the street below, their engines idling. "The council is gone, but the shadow bank remains. We need you to authorize one final transfer. Do it and I'll give your mother a real life. Refuse and the Philippine police will find a Korean drug runner and his accomplice in this apartment tonight." Min-jun looked at Hana. She wasn't crying. She looked at him with a fierce, heartbreaking pride. "Don't give them anything," she whispered. Park's hand moved toward his pocket, but Min-jun was faster. He didn't lunge at Park. He lunged at the apartment's smart hub, the biometric sensor that controlled the locks and security. He slammed his scarred pinky against the sensor, but instead of a normal login, he bit his lip and focused. He recalled the hidden sequence Han had taught him in the service tunnels, the kill switch rhythm. The apartment lights turned a violent, strobing red. A high-pitched squeal erupted from the speakers, a digital feedback loop designed to fry any nearby tracking equipment. "If I'm the heart," Min-jun shouted over the noise, "then I'm going into cardiac arrest." He grabbed Hana's hand and bolted for the fire escape. Behind them, Park was screaming into a radio, but the signal was a mess of static. They scrambled down the metal stairs and into the humid alleyway. Min-jun knew they couldn't stay in Manila. He knew the biometric sync meant he could never use a piece of modern technology again. He looked at his scarred hand and realized the only way to be free was to truly disappear into the parts of the world that didn't use sensors. He led Hana toward the docks, his mind racing. He didn't have a dragon to save him this time. He only had the lessons of the iron market and the weight of his father's memory. As they reached the pier, a familiar figure stepped out from behind a stack of shipping crates. It was Han. He looked older, his face weary, but he held a set of keys to a battered, rust-streaked trawler. "I told you I'd be your shadow," Han said, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "The shadow bank has reach, but they can't follow a ghost into the Indonesian archipelago." Min-jun looked at the boat, then at the city lights of Manila. He took the keys from Han. He turned to his mother and saw the sunset reflecting in her eyes, the same orange and gold he had seen in Incheon. "Where are we going?" Hana asked. Min-jun looked at the scar on his finger, then at the vast, open sea. "To the eye of the storm," he said. "Where the wind is still." The final shot shows the battered trawler moving into the vast blue of the Sulu Sea. Min-jun is at the helm, his school uniform replaced by a simple fisherman's shirt. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out a small, heavy object. A single blue diamond. He hadn't tossed it in Korea. He had kept it for the day they truly needed to start over. He looks at it for a moment, then hands it to Hana. "For the house," he says. She takes it, and for the first time in 10 months they both breathe without looking back. If you believe that freedom is worth the price of a name, hit the like button for the widow's son.